Thanks, Maria. Thank you very, very much. Over to, I mean, saying the whole day Rothney, but it's Rothney.
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 Yes,
Rothney Tshaka from the University of South Africa. Rothney, over to you. Rothney will speak to us about the continuing relevance of black liberation theology in South Africa. Rothney, in many ways, many of us who engage in the liberation struggle are the children of BC. The dominant political discourse today, of course, quietly wants to pass over that cup, forgetting that 76 was not the product of the National Democratic Revolution. It was not the product of the Freedom Charter. In fact, the African National Congress was caught completely unawares.
Sorry, Professor, and to interrupt, but to say they even distanced themselves from 76 for a while in the United Nations.
Yeah, I mean, my comrade from the Pan-Africanist Congress, he has to rub it in. No, you can interrupt, Shay, that's fine. But you can't rub it in. That's out of order. That's out of order.
It's called salt.
It's called salt. And so, look, let me be honest with you and tell you that I'm one of those people who've walked away from the black consciousness tradition a long time ago. But I'm honest enough to know that when I was a student at school, that we were moved by that. I'm honest enough to know that to whatever you may want to ascribe it, the memories, the dominant memories of the 70s that gave rise to our generation, the dominant memories was not the memories of the National Democratic Revolution. It was not the memories of the Freedom Charter. It was a new memory, inspired by Malcolm X, inspired by Nyerere, Ujamaa, inspired by Nkrumah, but inside South Africa, Steve Biko, Seth Cooper, Strini Mudli, Bani Patiana, these were the people who had inspired us. And it was black theology. And later on, of course, as we all know how history becomes the history written by the victors, all of these gets buried, and then we have the emergence of contextual theology, we have the emergence of liberation theology, but black theology becomes the new marginalized, to which I have been complicit in. And I look forward to you reminding us about where we come from, but more important, why that remains relevant for us in South Africa today. Thank you very much, Rothney.
Well, Farid, now that you have said all those things, I'm wondering whether I should still continue this conversation. I'm happy, though, that I made it to this conversation, because I think it's important. It is an important space, and I'm particularly glad to listen to the papers of both Charles and of Maria. Let me just preface this talk by saying I am a minister in the United Reformed Church in Southern Africa. I've done most of my training in the Western Cape, first at University of the Western Cape, then Stellenbosch, Amsterdam, and back to Stellenbosch. I have titled the talk today simply as some notes on the history and future of black theology of liberation in South Africa. And I've done that because every time when I have to speak about theology and theological reflections, I'm always asked about the relevance of this. You know, do we still need to speak about black, and why do we still need these kinds of things? Because we are in a dispensation that is different from that of the past. And so I have my own personal reasons why I engage in this, which might not come completely out of this text, but as we engage one another later. So let me try to read this so that I don't spend too much time, and then we can come back during question time. So, the subject of Black liberation theology remains an important one for me, particularly when statistics indicate that Christianity is gravitating towards the global south. Since I intend to involve in this conversation, I propose to do a few things and then wait for a time that we can engage one another. I shall make reference to the historicity of Black liberation theology, and I use the word Black liberation theology intentionally and not only Black theology, because there has always been the temptation for Black theology to become elitist and not or to eschew its communal responsibilities. There are some people, some Black theologians who are Black theologians but have nothing to do with regards to communities and their involvement and activism in communities. But also in this, I want to speak about the question of the Black church. Actually, I am of the view that if you look at the history of South Africa, we are not really in a position to speak about a Black church in the same sense that Black people in the United States can speak about a Black church. And this is simply because within the mainline church traditions, you always had the mother churches who then gave birth to the daughter churches. Black and colored churches would be your daughter churches, and those churches were never allowed the opportunity for self-determination. These are also the same churches whose theological education is still dictated to by the mother churches. And so different from the US context, where you have, for instance, some of these African Episcopal churches that totally with Ireland broke away from the mainline churches, could therefore put a theology that is relevant for them into the ministers who are going to serve them. So patronage in a South African context became more if there were indications of the daughter churches exfoliating their cultural skins and perceptions. If you could mimic the white mother church more, it meant you could get more support, etc., etc. And that's one of the reasons why these churches, particularly the mainland churches, tried very hard to mimic the mother churches. Now, there's also perception that has created by academic theology. And academic theology during apartheid was, of course, dominated by Reformed theology. In most of the universities in South Africa, you would have the Reformed as being the major church tradition. So you have perceptions also among black ministers of looking down on the Zionist or the Africanist churches in that sense, because they were not perceived to be well educated, etc., etc., etc. And these were all, in my opinion, opportunities that were lost if one were to speak about a theology that is relevant to the African context. I mean, academic theology, what it prided it chiefly on was to try to make of black people smaller Bartians, slimebachers, and stuff like that. And as Carter Woodson speaks, the miseducation of the Negro is one that sort of, we tended to think of ourselves as better than those who have not done the Barts, those who have not done all of those kinds of things. And that's why the Zionists, some people tended to make jokes about them. Thank God I was not born a Zionist or in the church where people go to the Zionist church, because of the perceptions that came as a result of, created by academic theology. So another important also aspect in talking about the black church is that you have to engage with the notion of spirituality. Now, black liberation theology in this country, to a certain extent, tended to move a bit away from spirituality, precisely because they wanted to link structural justice to faith. And if you have a mother who believes that God is going to give you this, it's nothing to do with politics, it's very difficult for you to speak equally of spirituality and, stuff of Marx and politics and stuff like that. But one learns that if you think of the black church in the American context, you have to think of slave communities who organize themselves, in a way of trying to understand and make sense of their existence in a foreign land. You have to you have to think of how these songs, for instance, the Negro spirituals, originate from being songs of work songs, and then became later the Negro spirituals, people wanting to understand, how God can allow these situations, or also for them to become complicit in those situations and stuff like that. So you get both in the context of South Africa and the USA, people not wanting to link explicitly spirituality to social economic issues. It is all, Gumbaya, my Lord, that's basically it. It has nothing to do with the situation. God is going to make a plan somewhere, somehow. But I'm saying in the case of South Africa, this was basically because we still continue to have a theology dictated through the black congregations by the mother church. If you go to Stellenbosch, the curriculum that is followed there is the same curriculum that ministers in United Reformed Church are going to follow. And you can just count them. So it remains the dominant one, like in that sense. I'm quoting a bit of Cohn when he speaks about spirituality. He speaks of the ambivalence of spirituality. He writes, to create the future in this extreme situation of American slavery was very difficult for black slaves. It meant accepting the burden and the risk of the not yet. He continues, actually, when they encountered the divine presence and promise as revealed in the event of Jesus' death and resurrection, they knew that there was only one possibility for authentic human existence, and that was to live in freedom for the future. Logic, therefore, becomes nonsensical in that situation. So basically, that is for me the issue. And if you look at those issues also within the United Reformed Church, which in my opinion cannot really be called a black church in the sense that it is self-determination, in the sense that it looks at its presence as very important for theological reflection. You do see those kinds of similarities there, but of course those similarities are also different given the different context. The history of black liberation theology in South Africa. Now, black theology of liberation emerged in South Africa during the late 1960s. As the project, it was inspired by the civil rights movement in the USA, the prophetic voice of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X's critique of white racism in the USA, as well as the pioneering work of James Hall Cohn. It was transported from the shores of the United States of America to South Africa as an intellectual project, which was made possible by the then University Christian movement in 1971. And all this happened under the directorship of Basil Moore and was spearheaded by Sabelo Ntwasa. Black theology of liberation was expressed under the banner of the Black Consciousness Movement of South Africa, which owes its being to the students such as Steve Biko, Bani Pichana, and Farik has mentioned some others there as well. And so basically, that is how it landed to the South African shores. I argue that it is perhaps fair to describe black theology of liberation in South Africa as a guerrilla enterprise. And I'm saying this for the following reasons. I don't think that black liberation theology was totally welcomed within South African academia as well as within the churches, precisely of the reasons that I've said. If you have a church that has been patronized by the mother church, it was very difficult for them to really peculate the communities that they wanted to ameliorate. And so it continued its existence through seminars and black ministers' caucuses, basically. That's where they could get together, share some knowledge, etc., etc. But it was never something that was accepted in academia. It was a guerrilla thing that happened somewhere there. Thus, those that engage this theology had to find alternative platforms as the ones that I've just mentioned here. It is very interesting to note that this became a dominant perception in the reflection of the very black protagonists of black theology. That perception is the divide between those who did theology at universities and seminaries and those who did not do theology in that. So there was also a perception that these ones are considered the real and the right ones. The fact that black theology of liberation was a guerrilla enterprise posed significant challenges to its attempt at peculating the very black communities that it wanted to empower. First, since black theology of liberation was chastised as improper theology. Now that's the other thing as well. We've heard some of these things when Farik spoke earlier on. black theology, feminist theology, and stuff like that, they were always considered not as real theology. Now, precisely because black liberation theology tended to make use of Marxist analytical tools and argued that the experiences of black people must be taken very seriously in our theological reflection. It was never seen as proper theology, and that is why you have what I like to call the methodological restlessness. Every black theologian, when he had to write about black theology, had to explain methodologically that what I'm actually engaged with is theology, to prove to the dominant hegemonies that what we are doing is actually theology. It might just be done in a different way, but it is in fact a theology. When taking the different role players in the emergence of black theology of South Africa into account, one cannot but wonder whether the suggestions today that this theology is relevant were not to be expected. I pause here in a bit and say, if you take into account how this theology came to South Africa, I mean, you had, of course, your white liberal counterparts involved in this as well. We can mention Bessel Moore and other people there. I find it very problematic that, every time when you speak about these issues, people are saying, but you are doing it and you are excluding people who are not black in that sense. But my argument is, if we are to agree that there seem to be challenges and problems that gang up particularly on black folk, then it does not help us to try to have an evasive kind of language so that we then don't deal with issues as they are. I'm not saying we're not doing it in exclusionary manner. We're just saying, why does it seem that some problems that are in other instances preventable are the very issues that are the result for the death of some people, basically? And I also think that in the context of having lifted South Africa up as the miracle child of the world, it is even more problematic to want to speak about a South Africa that is not racialized. We are racialized. And by speaking about race, it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to enforce those ideas. It simply says we are only going to win this if we acknowledge where we're coming from and to speak about issues for what they are. Farid has also mentioned about the move from black consciousness to contextual theology, and today the much popular notion is public theology. Now, I don't have a problem with public theology until it gives the impression that black theology did not do what they are claiming to be doing today. You see, so those are some of the challenges that I'm having. And the last point that I want to make is the future of black theology of liberation in South Africa. The first democratic elections of South Africa in 1994 is perceived to be the best miracle to happen to this country, which is a country fraught with contradictions. And some prefer to see it as a clean slate and intentionally prefer to discount a history of exploitation of black peoples in this country. Now, I subscribe to a school of thought which is of the view that capitalism and democracy are contradictory. Some Peter Blanche argues that while democracy emphasizes joint interest, equality, and common loyalties, capitalism is based on self-seeking inequality and conflicting individual and group interest. What is more important, notes Peter Blanche, is that the legal system that protects both democracy and capitalism is based on the principle of equality before the law, but maintains inequality in the distribution of property rights and opportunities in the capitalist system. For him, the logic of capitalism, given the unequal freedoms and unequal rights upon which it is based, goes against the grain of the logic of democracy. It is important for me to point this out, simply because democracy is invariably thrown in like a cat among the pigeons. I don't think in this country we have gotten to a culture where we can really debate about issues. And this has to do with how we are perceived by the world. And every time when you mention issues, that people like Peter Blanche and others mention, the democrat or the constitution that we have is lifted as that ideal that everyone has to strive to. And I say there are a number of parts that are very important and that I am willing to accept. But it becomes difficult if one uses this without taking into account what happened prior to that. Our obsession to be relevant and to illustrate that black theology of liberation is indeed genuine theology has done tremendous harm to us. We had become alienated from our context, and in some instances we had been assimilated into the very structures of oppression that Black Theology of Liberation was struggling against. What must be said outright is that there is no future for Black liberation theology in South Africa unless the theological enterprise will create its own space and dictate its own terms for its continuing relevance and survival. If you speak about Black theology or Black theology of liberation, people's eyes always become big and stuff like that. But I'm saying that there's equally white theology happening without naming it white theology. Just I mean, as a Black person, I've been in many white spaces or white theological spaces, and there would be nothing that says white there. You know, just for instance, a conference on predestination, for instance, at Stellenbosch, and people arguing, you know, things that you think, well, this might be probably important, but I don't think I understand how this important is. This is for the context that I want to go and minister it. By the way, I did my PhD on Karl Barth, so it's very interesting how you are taken very seriously when you do research in those areas. And from time to time, people will always come and bring you another book on Karl Barth, giving you an impression that, you know, you can read as much, but you'll never get to where you get at. But once you begin to say, what is important for me and the context that I want to minister, and once you begin to say, you know, this myth about Africa not having a history and stuff like that, then people become restless, because there's no book that they can prescribe to you to say, you go and get this book now. Because this is my story. I noticed no one can tell me my story more than I know my own story. But well, that's just something that I'm throwing in there. The point that I'm trying to make is that I think Black liberation theology, there was a need for it. That's why it was created. I believe that it was a means towards a particular end. And I believe that from time to time, one needs to pause and ask oneself whether the objectives that it set it out for itself has been met. And I believe that everyone who is sincere in dealing with the colonial and the racist past must be a person who wants to have a conversation and say what he or she believes about these issues. I have colleagues who would tell me, you know, Rothney, but don't you just want to be a theologian? Why do you want to be a Black theologian? We are Black. You know, I'm a Black person, and my Black context is the one that informs my thinking. I believe that South Africa there are still many South Africans in one South Africa, which you can see on Sundays, which you can see, you know, in the mornings and in the afternoons, you know, depending on where you stay. How some people are bussed in and what time they are bussed out. My point is, we're not dealing with these issues when we deal with the race thing as if it is something that must not be talked about. South Africa, I think we have not done a good job in speaking about the race issue to the way that we can really try to transcend our past. So I want to end. Of course, I've jumped a lot of things here, but I want to end with that and hope that, you know, maybe there are questions that I can respond to.
Thank you very much, Rothney. Very, very great overview. Elena on my side here, and then Charles on the other side, and then Mustafa there, and then Mati there. Elena.
I have a question about what you briefly mentioned in the beginning, and about the commitment to communities. Because you have, you know, in that scriptura, Buffel makes the point that a lot of Black theologians are not necessarily part of communities, and you have Alistair Key, who says that, who writes in the Rise and Demise of Black Theology, that in South Africa during the regime, Black intellectuals were silenced by the apartheid government, but now by administrative duties and all this. So what do you think is the real situation? What comes to the involvement and engagement with communities, and how does that impact the how do you see the connection between that and the relevance of the theology?
Yes. Well, first and foremost, I believe that there is such a thing called the black experience in South Africa. And for me, it's because of that I'm saying perhaps there is still a need for us to ponder how those people relate to God in that situation. Now, there's a number of things that happened, in 1994 or after that, when you had key black theologians being sucked into government. Some of them became principals at universities. Some of them became, directors in government and stuff like that. And so I don't know if you know the multi-event of 1999. There was a multi-event in 1999 which was held by the likes of Ramphele Mamphele and all of those people who used to be very vocal. It was held at the University of Cape Town, where they intentionally moved away from black consciousness and black theology and tried to look for a more neutral, inclusive language. That is, if you look at Cochrane's stuff on the multi-event of 1999, you'll get documentations of the likes of Tshaka beginning to move away intentionally from black theology and black consciousness and trying to look for a neutral language. Now, that for me was informed by, where government wanted to get at. And the fact that much of business still, the economy was still controlled by white folk. And so you needed to get these intellectuals be the vocal ones so that they can then buy into that. After that, you had many people saying, well, there's no more need to talk about black theology. Let's have contextual theology, let's have other kinds of theologies. But I'm saying a theology that does not take the black experience seriously cannot continue to be a theology. Now we have had, the reform Protestant theology has always been the one that, with Calvert, of course, the total other, focusing on the transcendental of God. Nothing to do with the situation here, but theology must start from God, that kind of a thing. So my argument is, I think we are not being sincere in saying we don't need to speak about black or white today. Now I'm saying, for the same reasons why you have now the emergence of white studies also in South Africa, was precisely because whiteness has continued to be this unexamined norm. That's why people are very quick to point to the other. But I've never had a white person call his husband my white husband. But you'll always call your black friend my black friend, because there's the norm and everything else is that thing. But for the same reason that we have that, there must also be the other side of the conversation, which is what our past has done to black people themselves. I believe that there are problems that were as a result of the fact that we have been the other created. Cornel West speaks of the pathology of black self-hate pathology. You look at what is happening in communities. That's why Biko spoke about if you grew up in a township, it is a miracle if you made it out of that. But this has to do because this has been a creation, and so we have never dealt with that. People think if you take a black person and make him a director, then everything is well. But what about what he has internalized as a black person, that mine is inferior, mine is secondary, and stuff like that? You have this guy, and you think it's well because you have a black guy at the top of that. So I'm saying there's a number of things that no one but black people themselves must be dealing with, and they cannot wait for anyone to tell them. There's also this perception that black people were perceived as the perpetual child. You're a child forever. You are always the student. You are never the teacher and stuff like that. And you can't wait for someone else to tell you that you need to grow up. Harold Cruz has said that in the crisis of the Negro intellectual, that no one is going to do for the black person what he or she can do for himself. I mean, otherwise you're always going to be at if you're at your neighbor's mercy for your survival. It's a terrible feeling. So I don't know if I've even answered you. I am saying, especially when I'm in the presence of the Tshakales, the Musalas, I speak even harder of the relevance of black theology today.
But are black theologians, are they engaged with the black community in in a way that that instructs the theological.
Okay.
That was sort of like, because I think that's the critique that comes from Buffalo.
Yes.
Or
I know the critique of Buffalo. First, I think it's important that we don't cluster black theologians in one thing. That they are not all homogeneous. They are different, and there are those who by choice prefer to be called black theologians, and there are those who by choice prefer to be linked to ministry. I mean, to be a minister in the church, so that you try to practice the theology. But there are also those who are doing theology as a profession and not linking activism to that. It's just some science that you do somewhere there. You people go to you when they want to ask you some things that you comment on, on TV, stuff like that. But you have no communal obligation. You don't feel that you have a need to be involved in a project on the ground to make sure that what you practice is what you preach. So there are selected people, who get together, having seminars, but these are also ministers who are involved intentionally in churches, in some NGO things in communities.
Thanks, Charles.
Right, I mean, just that one. Nobody said that Karl Barth could not be a theologian if he was not living after Safenberg. Nobody said that. Yeah. But immediately when the black or people pointing a counter grammar come across, the first thing they ask is, what is your location?
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no location required when doing theology. I mean, you didn't ask Tillich or you didn't ask Emil Brunner, but you do ask Cohn.
Yes.
What are you doing? I mean, I just say that actually two different normative begin to emerge in the region.
Yes.
But I look at this debate from both America and South Africa side, right? So, I was at Union. I taught at Union with Cornell and Jim Washington. Yeah. As a first batch of black faculty, we came together, right? Cohn was already there. And one of the questions that kept coming was that, are we going to follow Booker T. Washington or are we going to follow W.E. Du Bois?
Okay,
That is actually where the whole intellectual tradition gets divided.
Yes.
Whether you say the white world we have to adjust to, or do you say the white world is just simply wrong and therefore we must create an alternative way of looking at it? And those debates has remained, you can see that in Cohn fighting with Wilmore. And the whole tradition there you get.
Yeah.
So this is, what I worry about here is twofold. One, that the black question, the color line question, Peter Paris rightly says, is a permanent fissure in the American psyche. Permanent fissure. It will remain because it enslaved people. It actually took their right to labor. They could not own their own labor. I mean, women could not own their own labor. Men could not own their own labor. That is a very different experience than actually having your land stolen from you here, which is much closer to the Native American experience, right? I mean, this is what I'm saying. So the quick move from American black experience to South African black experience, to me, bothers me epistemologically a little bit. Because it is much closer to the Native American experience. It was the land reforms of 1913 and, reservation creation, labor being taken. You had to work as a labor so that the mine owners could get free labor. All those series of things were different because there they had no right to that labor.
Yes.
So, and I think that made a difference in the black thing.
Yes.
Here the question was, everything belonged to me and nothing belonged to me. This is my land. This was my labor. This was my... And all of a sudden, nothing belonged to me. And I think that's a different cut. And so that... Take a wine DeLorean. That God is red. That is much closer to the debate on the reservation. So I think so the Negro spirituals were written by people who had absolutely no hope. So not only kumbaya, but think of it. They're coming to take me away. So apocalyptic vision. But it was also political. This was the Underground Railway. So actually they were writing a coded message in the Underground Railway. Right? The swing low, sweet chariot for commuting. This was actually underground talk. A language that was coded that was brought. Here we never got that directly in the same way. I mean, even if I look at, we adopted into this in different ways. I think the Black Conscious Movement, Steve Biko, to me is the radical moment in the South African, because he actually emphasized not the color black as only the pigment version. But it was actually here.
Exactly.
In here, everywhere, this black issue. Fanon came to mind every time I read Biko.
Yes, but he was influenced by Fanon.
Yeah,
very
exactly
much
what I said. This.
Well, you see, the point is, this country is, we are a very pretentious country. We are pretending all is well in this country. Now you need every time when you mention the word Zimbabwe, people get excited unnecessarily. But you need to check what happened to before Mugabe just decided to do the crazy things that he has done. There has been the perception of speaking about, the agreements by at Lancaster and stuff like that, and nothing happening with regard to that. So we are a miracle child, you see. We have to behave as if everything is well in this country. We're not supposed to speak about race. We are supposed to be this people that get along quite well, which is very strange because if you look at where we go to, where we get out of this place or even from our workplaces, then you realize that we are sitting on a racial powder keg. And if we don't deal with these issues now, we're going to be seeing much more crazier stuff. I'm just saying the reason why some demagogues are taking over the race debate is because academia is not even doing what it's supposed to be doing. It is not having a conversation in a proper way, so that people can then begin to have, and in the absence of no leadership, people take whatever is there. So I'm just saying there history is there to just prove to us that you can cover things for so long, but it does not stick there forever. You see, so that's why I'm saying we have not had that conversation, because you have to look at how you say things. If you go to a presentation, you look at who is there and how am I going to say this thing. It's like getting onto the pulpit and realizing that, yuck, I have people in the audience that I don't think must hear this conversation. And that is basically the South African problem. We are a very pretentious country. We pretend all is well. And then we are surprised when there are eruptions of race things. Like, what happened? Who are they? Where are they coming from? The same people, the people are like, how? I didn't think we should have the Afrophobic attacks that we had. Why could we do that? So we are not having the conversation in the right way. And academia is failing this country by not insisting. The only time that we want to say things is when the government is going to give us some money. And then we're going to have a conference so that the government is happy with that. Because also, for whatever you write, you get some money. If you write a nice article, then you're going to... That's a lot of other things. But I just think you are spot on, but we are not having the right conversation yet.
Okay, very briefly, Mustafa.
Just connecting with what Maria said, don't you think the Pentecostal charismatic movement is also aimed at tearing apart the black liberation theology?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think black liberation theology unfortunately had an interrupted development. I think if you take it from where it came from, the fact that they hired out from the leadership of the masses, and then they left. It was only Busak who faithfully stayed with it for quite a long time. He was the only guy who did not. Okay, that's one point. The second point is not only the Pentecostals, but also African indigenous churches and how they are growing. Now, in some of my research, I speak intentionally of being African and reformed, because I think also there's a way for the reformed faith to begin to answer for a conversation that it never really had before. It has never had a platform where we could speak about what it means to be African and reformed, and to begin to see what elements can be learned, can be borrowed from being African and incorporated into this new faith. Now, every time when you say African and reformed, you are called upon to explain what you mean by African. Once again, the reformed notion is taken as understood and therefore in no need for explanation. But what do you mean by Africa? Because you see, it was this faith that came to help this African to be a better person and to assimilate him into this faith. Now you are saying it needs to pause and say there are things uniquely African that I think can make this faith even better. You see? So those are some of the challenges. So there's a student of mine who's writing on land, and a very catching argument has been, he speaks of the flight from the black self, the dislocation that has happened in Africa, which has fueled that flight from the African self. And that's why we are the biggest consumers of material stuff, because black people try always to create themselves in images that is more acceptable to themselves. I mean, look at, we go to the townships on weekends when there's some, the middle class is all over, it's in Senton, it's all over. Because we're trying to flee the negativity and the bad perceptions of the village and stuff like that.
Shahid, you have the last one.
I mean, you even see sometimes ads. I don't know if you saw that ad with the Kentucky, in the village, the old men when they eat and they call this boy after their hands has got a lot of oil in, and they use his head as a handkerchief until they discover chicken licken. Now they do this, so the boy's head is no longer needed. I see. I think the black theology. I mean, even Fanon, is it Fanon who said Marxist, even because you refer to Marxist analysis and tools, analytical tools, always need to be stretched when we come to the colonial question. Yep. And in this case, we need to speak about race. Because in typical, for some Marxists, race simply don't exist. I mean, I have an issue of race against myself. I hope that we can overcome it. But one has to look at least as a point of departure, as a point of beginning. And perhaps black consciousness is necessary today more than ever. But this time, where in a particular way where black consciousness will even educate whites, to liberate whites from caught up, in their own right. I mean, there are many things I think in our society that if we're not going to insist on black, but with the idea of one day overcoming it, so we can really speak about theology. I mean, the darling, for example, of South Africans, and you can see the superficialness, and you spoke about pretension in our country. Desmond Tutu, of course, and a great man indeed, is a darling. But the day that Desmond Tutu said that whites owe black people an apology, Desmond Tutu became overnight liar. I mean, and some of the things that we have to get rid of in South Africa. South Africa is not the miracle case. Zimbabwe is. In 1980, Mugabe and ZANU forgave. When it comes to living together, of course, what didn't happen in Zimbabwe, just referred, is the Lancaster House Agreement and everything. There was not a massacre of white people in Zimbabwe. So this thing that Mandela and I don't want to. Of course, South Africa is own unique.
There was a massacre of the Matabele.
Exactly. As Nelson Mandela could not forgive Winnie Mandela, for example, in the way he forgave.
The massacre of the Matabele and also...
No.
He could not forgive Winnie.
Yes.
Anyway, let's not go there.
Okay. Or for example, what I'm saying, I mean, my own point was that his point that we need to look deeper, that we need to get away from this pretension, because if we don't, and we're not going to be thorough, then we are not going to hope to create a discourse where people can hopefully. But at the same time also, I think that as you speak from black theology, and I think Elena's question is very much that we need to get more involved in communities, less even black, and you insisted on speaking about black liberation theology, the danger or the risk of it still remaining only with a few. I think that is what seriously needs to happen now, to see that how we link up to communities. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Rothney, for an excellent presentation. Charles, you have a last few comments, not longer than 3 minutes, because the Kentucky was overtaken by Chicken Licken, and Chicken Licken is about to be overtaken by Chicken Tikka. So if you're going to be much longer, you will be overtaken.
I want to say two very interesting papers I think for me. There are a couple of questions that I would have asked. Not questions. I'm talking generally that you can deal with in your thing. One of the things is that the question of vocation for Luther and the Reformation opened the door for the first time vocation was given a much larger play than has ever done before. Otherwise, it was always becoming a pastor or a priest. So he actually just, I said in the context of Islam, by the way, to become a soldier was a vocation. He could not go to war with the Turks because the Anabaptists were against him and the Catholic Church was asking for it. So the vocation comes about as an act of expanding the notion of God's calling. That Weber then picks up and does the Protestant ethics in the spirit of capitalism. So that everything we do must be done in the name of God as a vocatio Dei. So that's one side I want to say. The charismatic movement, to me, opens a number of doors, but it actually, to me, and this is my personal issue, I think it weakens its own position when it begins to look for success, rather than seeing that the Holy Spirit blows where it will, and it gives you power to stand up in the square, and what you do is you proclaim that I will pour out my Spirit on all souls, on all flesh, and everybody is going to prophesy, your men, your women. It's an inclusive, and that's been lost in the whole charismatic structure. And that, to me, therefore, it becomes a problematic application of the Holy Spirit. That just gives you that. To my brother here, I did a great job. You know, and having worked with those people, and we were struggling in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, you remember those years. I mean, Cornell and I and Jim Washington came at the same time. But here where I found the thing, Alan and I worked together, you know, I mean, we did this book together just now on the Karaka. So we were working on precisely these issues. That what is the contribution that will be made to this discourse from the African side of the Reformed tradition? Precisely on that ground. Because otherwise what happens is the Reformed grammar comes already packaged from Europe. And what we then do is we put added words, vocabulary into it. So we add a few words, African word here, we do this. But the whole grammar is already come packaged for us. And I think what we have to do is to challenge, just to give that the fact that Kant and Hegel are used as central paradigm, they make the most racist comment that you can ever come across. Enlightenment baggaged by racism produces our theology. And these people should never have been allowed. So if I didn't read the piece on the paper, that this is about the world. It's about the God's activity in the world. It's not about God's activity for God's self. That's what we do theology for. And that I wanted to say, you did a great job. Thank you.